You're listening to Binjang 91.5, and it's time for Tech Talk with Matthew Dickerson. Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning, Tony. Always great to be chatting Tech Talk on Binjang.
Yes. Well, today we're going to start off with taxis. Now, where in the world could I hail a driverless taxi? So, I mean, this had to come, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen a lot of talk, and it has been talk, around autonomous driving, driverless cars. And one of the areas that they believe they can control this, some of the people working on this, is in the taxi environment. So basically they've set aside a certain area, the kind of major CBD area, if you like, of Phoenix, Arizona. They've been doing a lot of testing there. In fact, before the pandemic hit, they actually had people using driverless taxis in a controlled experiment. So they had a select few number of people who were actually using those driverless taxis. And this is driven by Google's Waymo service. So Google bought Waymo a few years ago and it's been using that service. And so they were using that, and then of course the pandemic hit and a whole range of things got thrown out the window. But they're now ready. We're a couple of weeks away. I suggest by the end of October, if you're in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's pretty hard for you and I to get to there at the moment, but if we were in Phoenix, Arizona, we could put an app on our phone, we could order a taxi, and it would turn up, one of these particular taxis, with no human in the driver's seat. Now, they're being closely monitored, as you can imagine, at this stage because they want to make sure that it all works okay. They don't want to have an incident in the first day or a couple of weeks of it being used. But essentially, you'll be able to get in this taxi. It will take you to where you want to go. You'll get out. It'll all be controlled via the app. You'll basically pay the app. You'll put the location in via the app, and away you'll go. And when you think about it from a COVID-19 perspective, it probably makes people feel just that little bit more comfortable because services like Uber, which have obviously got a person in them, taxis as well, they've actually seen a sharp decline for a whole range of reasons. But one of the reasons is people don't want to be near other people during COVID-19. Obviously, people are travelling less, not going to work, working from home. So there's other factors at play. But that's one of the reasons. So this will be interesting to see whether or not they can actually get more people using taxis. And if this works well in Phoenix, the process that's happening in Phoenix is happening in 25 other locations around the US at the moment. So if this goes well, I can imagine you'll see at least 25 others in the US take off and then the rest of the world stand back.
Yes. Well, we'll wait and see. Now, the ACCC wants Google to pay for news content, and we've discussed this before, and it's been keenly watched by other countries. But in actual fact, other countries are making similar moves, aren't they, Matthew?
Yeah, they are, and it's actually good. We have talked about it before that they were really pushing pretty hard in Australia because Australia was seen as a bit of a battleground. If Australia got the laws through, then other countries would say, we'll jump on the back of that. So that's been working away, but there have been a few other countries that have gone down a similar line to Australia, and France is one of those ones that was actually a little bit ahead of Australia, and so they actually brought the laws in. They left it up to Google and other social media providers to have some reasonable discussions around amounts they might pay. And so that all seemed to be going along okay until Google decided to appeal it. And so that decision's just gone through the appeal process, and the courts in France have basically said, no, thanks for the appeal, but you've got to pay. And so now it just comes down to that process in terms of how much they'll pay. Google made all sorts of threats about pulling out of France altogether or not having any news content on Google sites available. But in the end, I think Google, being a little bit more pragmatic, realised the amount of money they generate in advertising revenue, it's not worth pulling out of a country or not delivering all the news. If you stop delivering the news, for example, people will just find another provider to get that news from. So I don't think they're sensible. And I think Google were trying to basically make some empty threats there to a certain extent. So that decision's come down. I think that will make it easier for Australia where we're at the moment. And certainly I think that if we monitor this over the next few months, we'll see this happening a lot in many other countries around the world.
Well, Matthew, as a news content provider with Binjang, I think it's a really important move to protect the decline of news gathering, not just in Australia generally, but particularly in regional Australia. Now, how many computers were shipped in the third quarter of this year, considering we're in the midst of the coronavirus? So what's happening in that space?
Well, earlier on in the year, some computer providers were seeing that they had a reduced number of shipments from a couple of perspectives. One was that they just didn't have the workforce to be able to produce the actual PCs they needed to get out the door, because obviously COVID-19 affected their workforce. But there was an increase in demand, so they actually had this bit of a backlog. But when it got to the third quarter, they managed to catch up that backlog. And compared to last year, for example, there's been a 13% increase. So 79 million personal computers were shipped in the third quarter of this year. And Lenovo led the way, if you like. But some other companies had some pretty big increases. So, for example, Acer shipped 5.6 million units. That was an increase of 15% over last year. Lenovo, as I mentioned, led the way. They had almost 20 million computers, 19.3 million computers shipped in the third quarter. That was an 11% increase over last year. And when you think about it, some people last year were almost predicting the complete demise of the PC industry, because PC shipments were dropping, things like tablets were starting to take over, phones were so powerful that people were using phones for lots of things. But this has been a real shot in the arm, and I hesitate to put a positive spin on COVID-19, because people have died around the world and there's been some terrible outcomes from COVID-19. But from a business perspective, some of these manufacturers, Lenovo, HP was in second place, 18.6 million, Dell, for example, some of these companies, this has been the real shot in the arm they need it from a business perspective. So, look, it's interesting to see where we'll go from here. Maybe with more people working from home, they'll need to have more notebooks, more PCs, because they'll need some at work potentially and some at home as well. But I think it has been a big increase, and whether they can maintain that, that's the big question going forward.
Yes, Matthew. And I might add that Lenovo is a Chinese company. And you've been listening to Binjang 91.5 Tech Talk with Matthew Dickerson. Stay tuned this afternoon for our next session at 3:40, and we'll see you there. And it's back to the great music and information on Binjang 91.5.
Thanks, Tony.